OMG, give me a second. I'm still sobbing over here. In absolutely the most emotional episode of 2026 so far, Emmerdale's Cain Dingle, Jeff Hordley, has told Moira Dingle, Natalie J. Robb, about his cancer diagnosis. The character was given his health news last month, but left the hospital with the intention of keeping it to himself. He confessed that he has cancer, and since then, Sarah has vowed to support him. This has been easier said than done though, as Cain believed that he didn't need any help and could manage things alone. He told Liam Kavanagh, Johnny McPherson, in today's episode that he didn't want to tell people because they'd just look at him and think cancer. His best mate gently reminded Cain that he's surrounded by people who love him and think he's strong. If it wasn't for Sarah's marriage falling apart as a result of Cain's behavior, perhaps the secret would have been kept for longer. Cain sighed and headed to the prison to see Moira. Moira was understandably shocked at the fact Cain had kept the diagnosis from her for so long, but understood his points about not wanting to add to her stresses, as the news came just as she got charged with double murder. Cain told his wife about the severity of his cancer and what will happen during his operation. The medical side to it wasn't too difficult to talk about, but they then discussed the very real possibility of Cain dying as a result of the cancer. Moira had to tell Cain that if the worst happened, Kyle and Isaac, Hughie Quinn and Bobby Dunsmuir, would be well looked after. They're surrounded by a chaotic family, yes, but one that is full of love. It's very rare we see Cain Dingle cry. Even during the aftermath of Nate Robinson's death, he barely allowed himself a minute to take stock, because he was so focused on trying to work out who murdered him. This level of vulnerability was only going to happen in front of Moira, the love of Cain's life. They were sat in a prison visiting room surrounded by coppers and people who have committed terrible crimes. It was one of the worst places to have a conversation about cancer and death, but the strong connection and intense love Cain and Moira have for each other meant they created a space either side of that table barrier, and suddenly it felt as though they were the only ones in that room. Moira helped Cain with creating a plan to tell more of the family. She reassured him that they'll all be by his side on the journey, including those he's recently lost. When Moira mentioned Faith Dingle, Cain's mum, that's when he really broke down. Faith was given a terminal cancer diagnosis before her death, but chose to end her life on her own terms. Cain struggled to understand Faith's decision to do this initially, but he told Moira today that his own diagnosis has made him understand. The conversation Cain had with Moira also saw him confess the truth about the state of Butler's farm, and how Joe Tate, Ned Porteous, wants them to sell up. Cain told Moira that he wasn't going to back down, and wouldn't let Joe get the farm. While Moira absolutely adores running the farm, Cain's health is more important. As time ran out, they both tried to reassure each other about the cancer and the situation with Butler's, but both were secretly aware neither of them could predict the future. The situation is bad now, but Cain and Moira knew it could get worse. Jeff Hordley recently said on a Zoom that this storyline would change Cain Dingle forever, leaving the hardened man many villagers once feared and despised behind. While the cancer diagnosis was always destined to have a huge impact, the real power of the story has come from watching Cain slowly accept something he's spent his whole life resisting. That it's okay to be vulnerable. The storyline began quietly several weeks earlier when Cain received devastating news from doctors. He had cancer. For a man who has spent his entire life projecting toughness and control, the diagnosis shook him to the core. Rather than confide in his family, Cain chose to leave the hospital with a plan: keep the illness secret. The idea of telling the people closest to him felt unbearable. Cain didn't want their pity. He didn't want the worried looks or whispered conversations. As he later explained, he didn't want people to look at him and immediately think of one word: cancer. So he kept the truth buried, at least for a while. Sarah discovers the truth. The secret didn't remain hidden forever. Eventually, Cain confessed his diagnosis to Sarah Sugden. Sarah, who has faced her own serious health struggles in the past, immediately vowed to support him. But Cain's stubborn independence made that difficult. He insisted he could handle everything alone. He refused help, and the pressure of carrying such a heavy secret slowly began to build. A warning from Liam. Everything changed during a conversation with village Dr. Liam Kavanagh. Liam gently tried to convince Cain that isolating himself would only make things worse. He reminded Cain that the people around him loved him deeply. They didn't see weakness. They saw strength. You're surrounded by people who care about you, Liam explained. But Cain struggled with the idea. Letting people in meant allowing them to see a side of him he had spent decades hiding. Vulnerability. The breaking point. The breaking point came when Cain realized that his secret was beginning to hurt the people he loved most. His behavior had started affecting Sarah's marriage, causing tension and confusion. The guilt weighed heavily on him. For the first time, Cain began to understand that protecting people from the truth might actually be causing more harm than good. He sighed. And then he made a decision. There was one person who deserved to hear the truth. His wife. The prison visit. At that moment in the story, Moira was already dealing with a nightmare of her own. She had been charged with double murder, and was being held in prison while the case unfolded. The timing of Cain's diagnosis couldn't have been worse. But he knew he couldn't keep it from her any longer. So he made the difficult journey to the prison visiting room. What followed was one of the most powerful scenes Emmerdale has delivered in years. A devastating conversation. When Cain finally told Moira the truth, the shock was immediate. She couldn't believe he had kept something so serious from her. But as Cain explained his reasoning, not wanting to add to her already overwhelming stress, Moira began to understand. Still, the reality of the situation was devastating. Cain carefully explained the severity of his cancer and the upcoming operation doctors had recommended. Discussing the medical details wasn't easy, but they managed it. Then came the harder part. The possibility that Cain might not survive. Facing the worst. The conversation turned to the future, a future neither of them could predict. Moira tried to stay strong, but eventually she had to say something no wife ever wants to say. If the worst happened, their sons Kyle and Isaac would be cared for. They're surrounded by a chaotic family, she said softly. But it's a family full of love. The moment was heartbreaking. For years, viewers have seen Cain as one of the toughest men in the village. But now that tough exterior began to crumble. Cain finally breaks down. It is extremely rare for viewers to see Cain cry. Even after the tragic death of Nate Robinson, Cain barely allowed himself time to grieve. Instead, he focused on solving the mystery of who had killed him. But this time was different. This time the emotions were too powerful to hide. Sitting across from Moira in the Stark prison visiting room, Cain's voice began to crack. Tears filled his eyes. And finally he broke down. It was a moment of pure vulnerability, something Cain has spent his entire life avoiding. Love in the most unlikely place. The setting of the conversation made the scene even more powerful. They weren't in their farmhouse. They weren't surrounded by family. Instead, they sat in a cold prison visiting room, surrounded by guards and strangers with their own troubled stories. Yet somehow, the world around them disappeared. The love between Cain and Moira created a quiet space where only the two of them existed. Across that table and the glass divider, they were simply husband and wife, facing an uncertain future together. Remembering faith. The most emotional moment of the conversation came when Moira mentioned Cain's late mother, Faith Dingle. Faith had also been diagnosed with terminal cancer before her death. But instead of waiting for the illness to take her life, she chose to end things on her own terms. At the time, Cain struggled deeply with her decision. He couldn't understand why she would choose that path. But now, facing his own diagnosis, Cain admitted something that stunned Moira. He finally understood. The realization overwhelmed him, and the tears flowed freely. The farm in danger. As if the cancer diagnosis wasn't enough, Cain also revealed another problem threatening their future. Joe Tate had been pressuring him to sell Butler's farm. Joe's plan was simple: take control of the land. But Cain refused to back down. Despite everything he was facing, he vowed that Joe wouldn't get the farm. Moira listened carefully. She understood Cain's pride and determination. But to her, one thing mattered more than land or business: Cain's health. Moira's priority. Moira has always loved running Butler's farm. It represents years of hard work, family memories, and personal pride. But as she sat in that prison visiting room, one thing became clear. None of that mattered if Cain wasn't there. His recovery had to come first, even if it meant making sacrifices. An uncertain future. As the visiting time came to an end, both Cain and Moira tried to reassure each other. They spoke about the operation, about the family, about the farm. But deep down, they both knew the truth. The future was uncertain. Things were already bad, and they could still get worse. A storyline that changes Cain forever. Actor Jeff Hordley has already hinted that this storyline will permanently change Cain Dingle. For years, Cain has been known as one of the most feared and complex characters in the village. But cancer has forced him to confront something he has always resisted: the need to rely on others, to ask for help, to admit he's afraid.